You are listening to Get Real podcast.
Well, these are some unusual days and times that we're living in, and we're going to do this edition a little bit differently. I'm going to date stamp this one. It is Sunday, March 15th, 2020, and Dan and I are right now self-quarantined in the fishbowl with everything that's going on out in the world. A lot of scary stuff going on out there, and we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what's going on in the world. So Dan, you and I were talking yesterday. You were sharing some stuff with me about stuff that you've been hearing and that you've been thinking about with this outbreak of the COVID-19 or the coronavirus. So
yeah, a lot going on. Interestingly enough, some of my nerdery over the years has been to study pandemics, study what happened back in 1918.
That's what you do in your free time.
What do you do in your free time? No, for real. I was like H1N1, H5N1, all the different ones. And I was like, yeah, we're overdue. And so there is a historical precedent. Over the last few years, just with the fall of the legacy media or the exposure, when we were kids, you were like, people would talk about a bias in the mainstream, like the three networks, they'd be like, and then you would sound kooky, right? And now they just full-fledged lie. I mean, just no conviction. They don't care. It's propaganda. It's Pravda. And so now I'm kind of more on what people would think of a conspiratorial mindset, not with everything at all, but I'm like, there are a lot of things that are true that we just don't talk about, right? And so when this first started unfolding, I was like, is this real? Is this weirdo control freaks in the world trying to do what they do? And there were a lot of weird things on both sides, but I'm not one of those that makes everything into a conspiracy.
Right.
And this one, it seems like it's real, whether or not it was manufactured or I don't know. There's evil people and evil stuff goes on in the world,
There is. And when we were talking the other day, and this is something that I want to share with our listeners, that this is going on. It's a real issue. There is a real virus that's out there. There is a real coronavirus. There's real things going on, and it's going on. I really don't know all the details as to why and what, but I do know this, and that is God is allowing it in his sovereignty.
Yeah.
For whatever purpose that he's desiring to work out.
And these things do happen. It's not like, what is going on? We can look back to 1918. It was horrible. And the weird thing about that one is it killed people in the prime of life. It killed people like 25 to 30 something.
That is unusual.
Yeah, it would overwhelm. It was called, I think, a cytokine storm, which their immune system would do an over response, and it would almost short circuit the immune system and kill the individual. It was really, really a horrible thing. But there's a lot of I don't know. A lot of interesting things just that get kicked around on the internet, and you go, like I said, about anything that leads me to nihilism or anything, then I'm like, I'm going to open up and question whatever I want to question, but that doesn't mean I have to be a weirdo.
You don't need the tinfoil hat.
Yeah, no, not at all. But this one, it's weird. Like, did you hear the thing about Wuhan? It's like a 15 million person city in China, that this actually broke out in the area where they have their bio defense like weapons laboratory, which is a little spooky.
It is a little spooky.
Did you see the photos of the bat soup?
I didn't see that. No.
Well, all over the internet, they eat some weird stuff in China, and it would be easy to really judge that hard, but they went through some harsh famines. Communism brings starvation and genocide every time.
And when you're hungry, you're going to eat.
You're going to eat. And so they passed a law in China, Glenn. This is interesting. During the famine, people got so freaked out, and the communists had all these laws where they couldn't get imports and couldn't get certain things. They got so liberal, they eat anything. I mean, they'll eat bats, they'll eat cats, dogs. I mean, they'll deny it, but they really do.
I think Mac knew that you were going to come up to that because he just started barking.
That was my intimidation move right there.
Studio.
Mac was like, "What did he just say?"
They're eating sky puppies?
Yeah. No, but they eat a lot of heavy duty stuff. But when you think about, as a society, going through starvation, where tens of millions, I want to say it was like 40, 50 million people died during those famines. And when that happens to a generation, they'll eat so I don't blame them. They'll eat snakes, they'll eat frogs. I mean, things that would not be on the menu for us. They're just like, oh, this is normal. So you'll see they're eating bats, they're eating these things. And you're like, you want to judge, but then you back off and go like, whoa, their parents or grandparents may have starved to death. This is a big deal. And so the wet markets, I learned a lot about those. They're disgusting. They don't think about hygiene the way that we do as far as the marketplaces. So they just have no refrigeration, all these types of meat, wild animals of every kind. And they're sitting out there, and the blood, the guts, the whatever, it just gets washed off with water. No bleach, no sanitizer, hand washing's not a big deal. So it's a perfect storm for this stuff to happen. So it's a real thing, whether or not, it's a really, really, really wicked thing. Although it's hard to identify the players. If you're looking, okay, where are the 33s? Where's the
right? If you're looking for the numerology,
and there's strange things afoot with this one, but not to the point. It's hard to see a winner. Who wins? The whole world's getting shut down. Everybody's going to financially hurt, other than if you're like selling toilet paper, I guess. Why is that such a big deal? I don't know.
I
Everybody
have no
runs
idea.
out and goes, is that the first thing you think of when you think of some deadly virus going around? You're like, my bum.
No, because I got plenty of coffee filters downstairs that can be used instead.
That's a good hack, man.
Useful tip for our listeners: if you run out of toilet paper and cannot get toilet paper, just use coffee filters, and it's cheaper to get a pack of coffee filters.
You know what's weird? Serendipitous even. I went out this morning at about 5:30 because there were other things that I wanted to get. Some of the things that we do with our business, we do need gloves, and sanitation is going to be incredibly important over these next few weeks. So I was like, I need to make sure I can still get gloves, like, work latex kind of gloves.
Yeah.
And so I went out to get those gloves, which I did successfully find. And I tried to get toilet paper, and I'm in this massive Walmart, and it's nothing. I mean, not even like paper towels. There was nothing on
Just
both
empty.
sides, completely empty all the way down. But the weird thing is, I bought coffee filters, a bunch of them. And I didn't do that knowing your life hack. And I was not industrious enough to put 2 + 2 together and go, hey, these are better than corn cobs.
Yeah, corn cobs. Yes, that's what they used, from what I understand, during the Civil War to clean their bahonkas.
That's what you're telling me.
Yeah. Huh. Now, that may or may not be true. That could be an urban legend, but that's...
Oh, I believe it.
That's what I've been told. So there's a lot of things at work going on here. Let's go back to just a few months ago when we started talking about nihilism, and we started talking about the fear of God. And we talked about not believing everything that the suits and the media that they're telling you. And that's what I really want to encourage our listeners to do. Is there's so much noise out there. It gets confusing. And there are people that are really scared. And this can be a very scary thing. Life as we know it is changing.
Yeah.
The way that we do work is changing. People are working from home. This is a total revolution in things. Education systems, what I'm involved in, going to a totally online system for classroom. Unheard of. There are online schools and online classes, but now it's this thing where it's really happening, and this is what they're looking at as being the delivery mechanism for classes right now. No classroom instruction, but just doing it all online. So things are being totally revolutionized right now. And what I want our listeners to do, and anybody who's listening to this, don't just give in to what the media is telling you. Don't just give in to what the panic and the hysteria and the chaos is saying. Seek the Lord and listen to what he's saying in this. Me personally, I am not scared of this. I am not terrified of it. It's not like I'm going to go roll around in a big bowl of Corona.
You're healthy.
I'm healthy.
And you're not that old.
Thanks. Says the guy who is 1 year older than me.
Yep.
I'm actually taking a look at this from what is it that God's been stirring in us here, and what is it that God could be doing for those that are believers. And I really see this as a time of refinement of fear, a refining of fear. Because when we go back to when we were talking about the nihilism edition, and I recommend all of our listeners, if you haven't heard that one, go back and listen to it. We talked about the fear of the Lord and what it says in Proverbs chapter 9 at verse 10, where it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the holy is understanding. And after we had done that, for me, with things that I'm working through in my life and things that I'm doing personally, I've had to fight a lot of fear. It's been fear factor for me. I didn't realize how much fear and how bound up my heart and my mind is in fear until I started working through these things. So I know that I am not the only person that deals with fear. We are so bound as a people by fear. As a matter of fact, if you look at the way most of the world runs, it's run by causing people to be afraid or intimidated.
Yeah. Oh, it's like instant dance. If you want people to buy certain things, scare them.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you know what? I've had 3 other people call about that particular Buick, but you know, and then people are like, fear of loss.
Yeah.
It's a classic close, man.
It is.
Throw a little wizardry on people and they buy. They line up.
And that you said that, the wizardry, basically the byproduct of witchcraft and wizardry is fear. It's intimidation and manipulation.
Yeah.
So if somebody's not walking in the Holy Ghost and they're not really trusting, or they're not trusting at all in the power of the Lord to do things, and they're not trusting and resting in his sovereignty, they resort to fear tactics. And I see this so much when I go on YouTube and I take a look at some other ministries that are out there that are exposing the evils of the media, that are exposing the evils of Hollywood. Now, I'm not downplaying that there's not evil there, but what they're doing is they're just feeding people what they want. They're tickling that fear, getting the adrenaline rush by watching, oh no, there are satanic themes in Mickey Mouse. And they get people all worked up about that. And there's no redemptive quality behind what's being done. It's not pointing them to logos, not pointing to, hey, well, this might not be, of the Lord, what's going on here, but this is. So look this way. It just feeds off of all of this fear. And in taking a look at this, a lot of what we know as the church, what we perceive as Christianity, is fear-based.
Yeah.
It's not the fear of the Lord, though, because there's a difference. And I want to talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. But that's how you get people to go to your church. You get them scared. That's how you get them to do what you want them to do, to control them. So a lot of our friends that we have that aren't believers, that are really cynical towards Christianity, I can understand where they're coming from. Because a lot of times we just stir that pot. You and I could get on here today and be like, oh, and I know that there are people doing this. Oh, it's the end of the world. It's the tribulation is coming. I don't know that.
Yeah.
I just don't know. All I know is that there's a bad illness that's out there. And if things get out of control, it could overload our healthcare system.
Yeah.
And I find it really kind of cool and interesting how the private sector is now coming involved in all of this to stem this up.
That was a good move by the president.
That was, yeah. Politics aside, you guys can care whatever way you want, but that was a really good move, bringing the private sector in, because the government is not here to take care of you. That's not what it's here for. Bring the private sector in, and this has been something that was realized after 9/11 with security, that the government can't handle it all. So, yeah, we need to depend upon the private sector to help out, and that's really where the brain trust and the brain power is in the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that was brilliant.
Fear it's very interesting. I remember reading a newsletter. I won't bring up the name of the ministry because it still exists, but the founder is passed. But and it was legitimate gospel believing, gospel preaching ministry. But they would send. I remember a good friend of ours. I was at her house and I looked, and she had gotten a newsletter from them. And they were using the most manipulative, creating crisis, fear tactic to try to get money and donations. And it's like, you see that politically with fundraisers, all that stuff. They're like, help us reach our goal. We're almost this. We're not going to be able to, and they create a crisis. They create that fear stimulus, and then you respond. And the reason people do it is it works. It really does work.
It's funny that you say that, because as our listeners know, we're working on putting together Rockfest in June with Disciple coming into Charleston. Rockfest is still on, so our listeners that have tickets and are planning to come, that's in June. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, but so far what I've gotten from the Lord is just to wait, be still, wait for him. He's sovereign. He's the one that kind of moved us into that date anyway. But when we've had these goals coming up that we've needed to meet financially to pay the bills, I could feel the fear start rising up in the inside. Be like, oh, I got to do this. I got to do this. I got to get on the phone. I got to go do this. I got to go do this. Basically, what I get is, Clint, just shut up, okay, and settle down. I got this. All right. And it's like, so for me, working through the different aspects of putting on probably the largest step of faith that I've ever taken in my life, I want to get anxious about it, but then it's like the Lord just speaks so clearly. No, don't do that. Don't resort to fear. It's going to be okay. And every time he has met the need that we've had. So for our listeners that are listening, and you're seeing all these great metal shows being canceled, Rockfest with Disciple in Charleston is still on June 6th. So we're making that happen unless we are told by the Lord otherwise to do something different. And he will direct the steps.
And you'll see.
He's sovereign.
Another thing, like, I do believe the better part of the world economy is an airball, separate show, but the whole fiat currency and where it's going, and just I think it's plagued. The other day the Fed prints 1.5 trillion. They just do that like it's nothing, but that is a staggering amount of money, and you can't do that forever. And since the crash in 2009, we've been doing that. Quantitative easing, quantitative infinity, quantitative until it blows up. It will blow up. So there is kind of a mercy, and I'm not saying that it's a good thing that, people are going to die from a weird disease, but there is a mercy in people being a little rattled out of the comfort zone instead of this illusion of the perpetually bullish market that it just keeps going up and up and up, and prosperity and prosperity. And for some of you around the world, in the United States, we've lived good for many years.
Real good.
Yeah, 2009 was the scariest thing that's happened to most of us. Now, I've lived in the third world. Glenn and I've met a lot of people and done a lot of things. So we get it. We can empathize better than maybe some just other people in the United States could. But that's why it's like toilet paper. Right. They can't relate with, oh no, I'm going to starve or I'm going to die. We've had everything. We got food just everywhere. And then so it's like, oh no, I'm going to be out of toilet paper. And that's that primal fear rising up in the first world problem way, I guess.
That shaking that you're talking about is something that I believe really is happening. God is showing us several things. I would say that this is, and everybody hold on to your seats, because this is going to be different from what you're hearing probably from your fear-mongering crowd. This is judgment in a way. Now, when you take a look at what judgment really is, it's not just gloom and doom and just boom, the hammer coming down. It's making things right the way that they should be. And when you make things right the way they should be, when God starts correcting things, it's painful. It's hard to be corrected, and it's hard to get on the right course of correction. So I see a lot of things here being corrected. And for us as believers, I see opportunities for blessing in this. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you take a look at when the plagues were coming upon Egypt, before Moses led Israel out of Egypt, nobody was touched from Israel when the plagues came. Nobody. Egypt, that was going on, and that was to get God's people to a certain place. So looking at everything that's going on here, I really believe that God is bringing us, as believers, his church, to a whole different place at this point in time. Because when you take a look at fear, we really don't have an understanding of it. I didn't have an understanding of it, even when we did the one on nihilism. I know what the scripture says, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Got that. But what about all this other fear? Because there are many different aspects of fear, and you see fear mentioned a lot of times in scripture. As a matter of fact, in the book of Revelation, we read that the fearful and the unbelieving will have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone.
I want to study that. That's always been a curious thing to me.
I want to talk about that.
Okay.
I took a look at that because this is really curious to me, because we're told, fear the Lord, and then we're told to fear not. And what I've been finding, and this is something that we've been finding as we've been looking at scripture, and that is the English language is very imperfect. When you take a look at Hebrew, which the Old Testament was written in, and you look at Greek, which the New Testament was written in, they're very precise, and those words have very precise meanings. We just kind of throw things around, and where are we at now? We're using the Urban Dictionary now, and that's pretty much where people are getting their definitions of things. So when you take a look in the book of Proverbs, the word for fear, the Hebrew word for it is yirah, and it means two things. It means reverence, and it means dread. Two different things, two different aspects of it. So to understand what it's talking about, you need to take a look at the full context. So if you take a look at it, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So for somebody who is not a believer, that fear is actually a dread. Because dread occurs when you're out of harmony with God.
Yeah.
There's really three things that people dread if you think about it. The first thing is God. That's why they stick their head in the sand. They dread the universe because the universe is scary. That coronavirus is part of the universe right now, and there are people that are dreading it. And the other thing, and it ties into what we're talking about with corona, you're looking at a dread of death. So when you're not in harmony with God, when you're not in harmony with the universe, the only thing you can do is dread it. And we've talked about this before, is we need water to survive. Water is a good thing. Water made that coffee. But if you drink too much of it, water will kill you. You can drown in water. Everything in this universe can kill you. That causes dread. Now, if you're living in the peace of the Lord, you're not going to have that dread. So, but then you have the one meaning reverence. And that's where God wants you to be. That means to fear him, to obey him, to listen to his voice, to acknowledge him and have faith in him. That's the difference. Instead of just running around doing your own thing and making up your own way to try to get to heaven and your own way to be spiritual. Revere the Lord. So when you take a look at the book of Exodus, chapter 20, when Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments, it says this in verse 18. It tells us that the people on the ground there saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. So when you read that, here we go again with the imperfect English language. They removed and stood afar off. In our mind, we think, okay, they removed themselves from the mountain and stood far away. That's not what removed means in Hebrew. It means to be timid and to dread, to shake and to tremble. So they shook and they trembled and they dreaded and they moved away from the mountain. That's what they did. Here we have it, that fear of the Lord. If you dread the Lord because you see the law and you see your sin, that's a good thing. But God doesn't want you to live there. As a matter of fact, being out of harmony with God is spoken of very clearly in Romans. We've talked about this the past couple days. Romans chapter 8, 6 through 8. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God. It's not in harmony with God. It's actually an enemy of God. For it is not subject to the law of God, neither can it be. What moves you from dread to godly fear is the cross. You can't continue to live in dread. And we experienced this when we were in the cult. There were days that I dreaded, actually most of them, going to Sunday service. Because I was afraid of what God was going to do, or what I thought was God was going to do through the guy that was leading the organization.
Yeah.
It was always this pronounced judgment. Well, you didn't do this week, so your family now is going to consist of a bunch of whores and prostitutes, and you're all going to wind up on crack.
And it's so weird because it was more subtle than that for the most time, but you still had those fears.
Yeah.
When we were leaving, it got really weird. But you know what's amazing, Glenn? If you look through the scripture and you look at different encounters of, let's say, Isaiah, he was a prophet. He was a great prophet, right?
Oh, yeah.
He heard from God. He prayed, all these things. But it's kind of funny because it seems like it can get redundant because when he had a revelation, when he was able to see, I guess, into heaven, right? And he had that numinous dread. He had that terror, even with the peace. But it was a whole nother level. Like every time it seems scripturally that when you have a great revelation of God and his holiness, there's always going to be part of you that freaks. And that's why the angels were like, "Fear not, don't have a heart attack on me."
Yeah.
They would come and show up, and the first thing that they had to, it wasn't like somebody was like, "Yo, what's up, bro?" To an angel.
Yeah.
Even that's not even God, but they were so stricken by terror. That's where I get lost a little bit with charismania, and I guess I would be considered a charismatic. I don't know what I am really, but it's like, if I'm rolling around and it's supposedly the Holy Spirit that's got such an overt hold of me or a grasp of my senses, at a point, at least statistically, I think it kind of departs from the scriptural norm. If I was like completely sobered and freaking out because of my intrinsic evil, or I was sitting there going like, I'm so unclean, and not in like beating myself up, but like Isaiah, he was willing to go forward and to pray, but he felt really bad about himself, about who he was in front of this holy God and all these things. Instead of it being some giggly, sensual like thing, I don't feel like I belong in most churches. I just don't. I don't know, Glenn. I'm a confused puppy sometimes, but
Coffee filters.
yeah,
That'll take care of all the problems.
That's what we need.
But in that true dread before the Lord, that conviction, and that's something we're going to talk about in a later podcast, what conviction really is, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about that too. That dread that you have before the holiness of God, there's a sweetness to it.
Okay. Yeah. I was about to say, if you can break that down, like with, let's use Isaiah, right? Mm-hmm. So he was granted in the Old Testament, but he was still a partaker. He knew more about the gospel. He knew the gospel.
He knew the gospel.
Okay,
yeah.
Big time. So it was like, okay, cool. He was full of dread. He was undone. He had this revelation, but like you say, there was an ecstasy. There was a sweetness involved in that. Huh.
Probably the same as the sweetness that you feel at that point in time of salvation, where you realize that you're undone, but it's sweet because you know there's a way out.
Yeah.
Or probably the most recent example for me, going back, 13 years, 14 years now, the day that I stepped away from pastoring and the Lord dealt with me, and you were there in the room when that occurred, that was not the place for me, maybe at that time, that I needed to step away from that. And the Lord just dealing with me of the things inside of me that I coveted that position more than feeling called to that position at that time. And being dealt with about that, I was getting spanked, but at the same time, it was awesome because I'm like, wow, God's talking to me. So he who is other than me and very much greater than me is talking to me, and there's a way out from what I've been doing.
It's kind of funny because sometimes just the attention of, God speaking to you or moving on you, it may be the words, "Hey, stupid,"
or "Shut up."
But you're like, he spoke to me. Hey, God spoke to me. What did he say, brother? Hey, stupid. No, I don't want to put words in God's mouth. I'm being funny.
Why do you think people are seeking so many different types of spiritual encounters? Because they want to have contact with something that is greater than they are.
Yeah, that's true.
Why are people so fascinated with, I want to meet an alien, or I want to have a close encounter of the third kind? I want to touch out, reach, and have tangible something that is greater or mysterious.
Yeah.
God built us to desire mystery.
I mean, we're pre-programmed for numinous dread. I mean, it's universal. There's not a single culture, like you have all these like loudmouth kind of atheist people that act like, oh, it's ridiculous to even conceive of being a deist. That's ridiculous. The notion has always been in human nature. There's not a culture that is devoid of spirituality or worship or a dread of the unknown, fear of ghosts, fear of spirits of ancestors, fear of the great spirit. It's intrinsic. You know what I've noticed over the last couple of years, especially going through all the stress, being self-employed during the recession and just reading all the headlines and reading about politics and economics, and just I would read and I would get, it was some sort of cycle, maybe a dopamine cycle or a cortisol, I don't know, but you work it and it gets you all worked up, like a cup of coffee, and then it's almost like you need it again and you need it again, and you get this sort of cycle going on. And then I started backing off when I discovered that I was like, you know what? Half of the stuff they're telling me, 90% of it is just nonsense. It's just fear. It's just they're lying to me. They're trying to get me to do something. They're trying to get me to buy gold or trying to get me to, do something. I'm like, you know what? I'm tired of that noise. So I started reading more books, and now I find it soothing. I enjoy listening to like St. Augustine. It's like it may be a 1,700-year-old work, the Confessions of St. Augustine, and you're listening to this affection for the Lord that man had, and he's pouring out his imperfections and his lust, and at the same time you just see how he loved God, and there's not that fear. That he's a good example.
Yeah,
he's a good example. If you haven't, for our listeners, if you haven't read St. Augustine, the Confessions of I want to say St. Augustine, St. Augustine, Florida. I go to there and I go to NASCAR down in Daytona sometimes, but yeah, I am from the South. I don't know what happened to my Southern accent. I listened to that show, the radio, when I was on terrestrial radio. Yeah. Oh my goodness!
Oh man, you sounded like we pulled you out of the bayou.
I was like, "Hey y'all, we're glad to be back today." And Diddy and them are gonna. No, I never had a twangy Southern accent, but it was stronger than it is now.
Than everybody. It's because you've been hanging around me.
Probably get all Connecticut up in here. No, but it's kind of funny because Glenn and he's Yankee born and bred, and I am Southern born and bred, and then fear. Yeah, fear. Yeah,
perfect love. Cast out all fear.
See, Yoda got it wrong.
Thank you.
I don't know what he was mumbling about. He's probably not regenerate. I haven't heard his testimony.
We need to talk. We need to sit and talk to him. Give him a call. But perfect love casts out fear. And here's one of the misconceptions that I had personally as a believer. And I think the misconception got kind of cleared up maybe like 72 hours ago in preparing for this. We get so arrogant when we're saved. It's like, oh wow, I understand the truth. I've seen it. I've seen the truth. And there's a childlike faith to it, and it's like a kid with a new toy or finding out something new in school. And you think, well, now that I'm saved, I must really do love the Lord with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And just the other day, it became apparent to me that in my life, that is not true.
Dear Glenn,
shut up.
Are still a jackwagon.
It's not true. Because having perfect love means that the only thing that you fear is one thing. Okay, it's real simple, people. There's only one thing you need to fear, and that's God. That's it. Everything else is nothing. Coronavirus, don't need to fear it. Now, you do need to take precautions and everything like that, but you don't need to fear it. Your life does not need to totally just shut down. You can get out of bed tomorrow and do things, even though there's a coronavirus out there. But perfect love casts out that fear, and when you're really moving in perfect love, and that word perfect means mature. So it's an evolving process.
Oh.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a nice breakdown, because I'm sitting there, we have this thing about perfect, thinking that it's got this ideal, this perfection, but the biblical use of it, a lot of times it means complete or mature. And then when you think about that, of this maturation and the beauty of a love relationship with God, learning more about him, being chastised, being brought up, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, you grow in that relationship.
So here we are with Corona, and where
I'm drinking coffee, actually.
Modelo.
You know what? Their stock, maybe
It went
not their stock.
down.
It's 40. I feel bad. I mean, it's decent beer. It's like 40. I think their sales are down 40% just because of name recognition. Shows the irrationality of fear.
It does. It really does. It really does. But for the bride of Christ, the church as a whole, when I said earlier,
Did we just go from Corona beer to the bride of Christ?
we did. We
Man.
did. But there's going to be good wine at the wedding feast of the Lamb.
Yeah, that's true.
There's going to be some really good wine there. When you take a look at this with what's going on and the church as a whole, and I'm really encouraged to see this. Our brother Stacy posted something today, and I posted it up on the Lithoscribe Facebook page, where he's encouraging people just to be still and to trust in the Lord, not to get all freaked out. And the majority of what I'm hearing from the church is don't fear. Just fear the Lord. Don't fear. Don't give into the chaos. Don't go into the panic. And I see this as a collective maturation of the bride of Christ. Maybe perhaps even for the next thing that he's calling us to.
Yeah.
The gospel has to be preached. And one of the reasons why the gospel has been watered down, and one of the reasons why it's not been preached in boldness, is because people are afraid. What are they going to think of me when I preach the gospel? What are people going to think of me when I tell them the truth that there is a heaven and a hell, and that the only way to heaven is through the shed blood of the Lamb? That's pretty bold stuff. And you have to get past all of that. If you fear the Lord, it becomes a non-issue.
Right.
But if you've got all this other fear that's got your heart and your mind all locked up, so I see really some good things possibly coming out of this for believers throughout the world, especially here in the United States, who are encumbered by Western civilization.
Well, let's say in the next few years, there is a massive kind of economic reset. There's been, David Wilkerson, there's been a lot of different people that have talked about it. There's people that have degrees in economics that are like, this whole little fiat thing we got going on it's been abused. It's not going to keep going. So if you can imagine, like I've thought about it, last 2 or 3 years have been tough on both of us, a lot of stuff going on. And it's like, sometimes you sit there and you go, God, okay, man, if I preach some nonsense gospel, then money, those people get money poured on them.
I know, yeah.
But you look at it and go, whoa, are you going to be better off if you've already started training and swimming in cold water? When the canoe tips over and everybody's in there, who's going to be ready to be a lifeguard or start pulling people out of the cold water other than somebody that had to start swimming in it early? And I'm like, you know what is God preparing us for? So in that aspect, I do think there is some mercy of having to walk through this. Now, in the modern day, if we were on like a farm in the middle of nowhere and you didn't read the Drudge Report twice a day or 10 times a day, and you didn't listen to Fox or CNN or whoever you listen to, and you didn't have all these talking heads going, you're going to die probably tomorrow, your kids and you, no, you're going to catch on fire, a plane falls out of the sky.
Yeah, stay tuned to Fox News to find out if you're going to die.
They're eating bats in China. Are they going to eat you next? It's like, and we get addicted to that. I think it's hormonal, and it's like, whoa. If you back off or you unplug from that and start going, so it's prince of the power of the air, using that manipulation, stirs up a bunch of fear. When you're under a bunch of fear, you're very malleable. We talked about that on the nihilism thing. You're fearing. How can you be fearing that and fearing God at the same time?
You can't.
Yeah.
I like how you bring that up, because the other day, again, this was a Dan and Glenn talk on the way home from work at about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I was thinking that day, I was like, where is it in Scripture where it talks about God bringing your worst fears upon you? He does that. Hold on to your theological seatbelts, strap on. I'm not being a meanie here by saying it, but there is biblical example of where God does bring your worst fears upon you. And I said, like, Dan, where is that in the Bible? Because I just couldn't think of it. And Dan got more Sunday school hours under his belt. You had what, all the attendance pins are going?
I think I got third or fourth in the Louisiana State Championship at Bible drill, actually. That was it was a big deal.
So I asked Dan, I was like, Dan, where...
I know all the scary scripture.
Yeah. where does it say in scripture about God bringing your worst fears upon you? And you're like, somewhere in Job. And you're like, I don't know, Job or something like that. So I went looking yesterday, and sure enough, it's in there. And I took a look at Job, and I went to Matthew Henry to see really what's going on in here. First of all, the thing that really popped out to me was that it was God that gave Satan the idea to sift Job.
Yeah.
That Satan wasn't like, hey, God, can I sift this guy Job here? God's like, hey, have you considered my servant Job down there? Why don't you go, pull him around a little bit and go toy around with him a little bit? That may sound mean, but you have to understand who Job was. Job was the guy, when you read in the first chapter, who's making sacrifices for his children just in case they sinned too much while they were feasting. To me, that sounds like anxiety. From the human point of view, it's like, oh, wow, what a righteous man, making these sacrifices for his children just in case they sin. Dude, do you know how many people live in the bondage of doing things just in case they sin? That is not how God intended us to live. God never intended, even under the Old Testament and the law, for people to live that way.
That's a real... That's real astute, bro. No, that's a good breakdown.
So
there.
God used Satan to shake Job up, a shaking like we have going on right now. Because when Job said, all of my fears have come upon me, well, one of the things that happened is all of his boys, when the wind came through, knocked down the house, killed all of his boys. And here he is making these sacrifices for them to keep them righteous just in case they sin too much. Now, did they sin too much? Or we don't know. But he did all these things to make all these precautions to take everything to be ready, and God blew it down. It was God allowing Satan to do that. And when Job said, all of my fears have come upon me, that word for fear used there is dread. All of my dreads have come upon me. So there are people that dread financial ruin. There are people that dread death in their family. There are people that dread all of these things. And God will allow those things to happen. He will allow those shakings to happen, especially financial ruin for people that are believers.
I'm so scared I'm not going to have enough money in my bank account. No, wait.
No, there are people
do
that,
the opposite.
Yeah,
let's let's wire this thing.
But there are people that live that way because they're afraid not of the Lord in reverence and, okay, God, you're my provider.
He's jealous of that misappropriated dread.
Exactly. Exactly. Where you're focused on what Job had, when you read it in the first chapter, is what we would refer to as sin consciousness.
Been there.
Yep. Been there, done that, ain't going to go back and do that one again.
Earlier, you were talking about kind of the arrogance that you can get after you get saved and you think you have a real understanding of something. And it's like, I guess on a knowledge level, I feel like I know a lot of stuff. But as far as revelation, it's like, it's weird. It's tricky. It's like the more that you see, the less you know about what you don't understand. The more questions you have. Maybe that's wisdom. Maybe that's fear. Because then you, at the end of the day, you're like, he's sovereign. I am this vessel of clay, either for honor or dishonor. It's up to him. And me fearing, oh no, it's not going to be, this or that or whatever. It's like, but then at the same time, not embracing some sort of foolish passivity. I'm not going to go lick a doorknob to prove that, I'll only get corona if it's God's will.
Exactly. No, or handling snakes.
Yeah.
No, that's
we weren't in that type
wise.
of cult.
No, not that one. No, more the doorknob licking one.
Hey, let's start a new cult.
The doorknob lickers.
Doorknob lickers.
Doorknob lickers, yeah. Going back to the fear and the way that we've been programmed, I was thinking about this. We have coronavirus. It's a pandemic. And unfortunately, Hollywood and television has really gotten us to this heightened sense of fear. Because you take a look at Night of the Living Dead, Night of the Walking Dead. Oh my, it's the zombie apocalypse that's going to come. And even many of you have probably read it. I haven't, but I really don't want to because I know it's really kind of more spectacular than what it should be. The whole Left Behind series that came out back in the 90s that everybody was just scooping up because it was so epic. All right.
I never watched them or read it.
I didn't. I just heard that it was probably a little bit more over the top than I saw a movie based on it. I think R. Lee Ermey, the guy who played the drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket, was the president of the United States in that edition of it. For some reason, I watched it. But I think we get programmed by Hollywood, by television, that when a crisis occurs, that it's going to be the zombie apocalypse. And in thinking of things, when you take a look at going back to the plagues that were upon Egypt, Egypt really didn't know why they were going through what they were going through. Pharaoh hardened his heart when he knew, but just the common guy that was living in Egypt, picking up the stone tab, the papyrus, paper. Oh yeah, we had frog plague yesterday. What does that mean? It wasn't Cecil B. DeMille epic. Does that make sense, Dan?
Right.
Movies and everything like that. I think when we eventually do move into the tribulation period and all of that stuff really starts to unfold, we could be starting there now. I don't know. But it's not going to be like the beginning of this epic movie. It's just going to gradually occur. And I go back and I think when Jesus walked the earth, he had his disciples and there were many that followed him, but there was a larger portion of the population that had no idea what in the world was going on.
Exactly.
Had no idea that he was there. It wasn't like, oh, wow, Jesus is here. And all of these big, grandiose miracles like you see in the Ten Commandments movie were happening. I think we over-exaggerate a little bit.
Well, yeah, we live in a weird time where the collection of eyeballs in the digital age to be able to focus on information all at the same time and to be manipulated through that or to be able to react instead of being somewhat segregated in individuality and going about your daily life, but yet probably having a very connected social network that when in a more authoritarian, at least in the United States. So I can just imagine a different architecture of a society where people, in their individual lives, they weren't sitting here knowing that, so-and-so, there was a rape and a murder. And then all the news that we get all the time, it's overwhelming.
With it, yeah.
No, it's weird. You were mentioning a president. You would make a decent president like in a movie. If I ever do a movie, I'm going to cast you as the president. And before the Mars Attacks 5.
Thank you, Mars Attacks 5.
I'm thinking of how you're gonna die. It'll be pretty cool. No, you're gonna do something cool, but you do probably have to get close to death. I don't know.
Okay, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
We get so in our mind, we create these vain imaginations, and then we miss it.
Say that again, one more time.
We create a lot of vain imaginations of what we think it's going to be, but then we miss what it really is.
And I think we're very much prompted to do so.
We are. We're prompted to do that through the media and through Hollywood. Again, look at when Jesus was on earth. Everybody had these grandiose ideas that at that time the Messiah was going to be the one that liberated them from Roman oppression. And because they were hung up on that grandiose idea at that time, they missed who he was. And how many times through life when we look back, even during the times that we struggle and we go through hardship and tribulation, and we're like, oh man, this sucks. This is horrible. Oh, this is bad. Oh, I don't know if I can make it another day. And then you look back, you're like, wow, that really wasn't as bad as I thought it was.
Almost every time.
Almost every time. It's the way that we think. We need to change the way that we think.
I think if you examined it, there's something to do with being plagued with perpetual fear and panic that seems to bring out the darker, more mediocre part of our nature. And when I'm talking about human goodness, I'm not necessarily I'm talking about ethical. not necessarily spiritual righteousness, right? But it's like, if I've heard different people speak, and I brought this up before, that were somewhat isolated, like a man that was falsely accused of rape, put in jail when he's 18, 19 years old, stays in there for like 20 or 30 years, and then gets out cleared on DNA. He never did it. But when that man spoke, he was isolated, went through all this suffering, went through all this stuff, but he was away from it all. He was locked up, doing hard time, right? And when he got out, the way he spoke, his intellectual way of being was very different. It was deliberate, and it had this, I would call it an integrity, a weightiness about it. And what happens is we're kind of an ADHD as a culture, as a digital culture, because it's panic, it's fear, it's salesmanship, it's manipulation. We're bouncing and we bounce. We would seem like flakes. Like, I was listening to Hardcore History, Dan Carlin, love it, recommend it, the other day, and he was talking about the king of Persia, and I like the way he's like, Dan, he could talk about something boring, and then they folded the tortilla. He could talk about something boring and make it super exciting. But he was talking about when they would take like an oath, and they would, cut an animal, and like kind of biblical sort of
covenant,
it'd make a covenant, but it was serious stuff. They would lie and cheat, but they did not publicly. It was a very, very honest culture that happened in different places, and a lot of them were very godless in the sense of the one true living God, but ethically they were deliberate. There was something. So there's something to even us being able to walk and be not flaky, about not being plagued with fear about everything else, because that demands your best. But here's the thing. It's hard for you to express loyalty when you're running away. It's hard for you to express patriotism of giving your life for someone else, for something else, for a higher cause, for the gospel, for anything. If I'm going to die, if that takes hold of you, you cannot be in true service. It would be like if I was taking care of my family and we're in a life or death situation, and we go off a bridge and our vehicle is sinking, right? And I could go, I'm gonna die, right? And try to preserve myself. Well, any man that would be worth his salt would be able to have to deal with that cowardiceness and have to go right back in and be like, he would get enough air, and then he would go and try to make sure everybody was out of their seatbelts. You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying.
And I'm not saying that's easy,
And to me, that sounds like something that's referred to in Scripture as a sound mind. Now, would you follow any man that was schizophrenic?
I think both of us probably did.
We did. Hey, wait a minute. Yeah. And look at the torment that brought into our lives. But God calls us to be the light, to be the leader, not the butt. We're called to be the leader.
Oh, man. You set up so much comedy, but I'm going to refrain. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was thinking toilet paper again. He calls us to be the leader. And you can't be a leader if you are double-minded. You can't be a leader if you're schizophrenic. You can't be a leader if you are not resolute. And this is the way we're going. And damn the torpedoes, we're moving ahead.
Right.
All right. It calls for being of a sound mind. And in order for that to happen, we have to do something. Or we have to put down the fear. We have to crucify our flesh. Dealing with fear. When you're first saved, you're dealing with all kind of small stuff at first, like the porn, all right? You're walking through that, or being angry, or using certain curse words and things like that. God deals with you on different things. Maybe drinking too much, maybe those things.
Punching people,
flipping people off in traffic, all the small stuff. But once you move past that stuff, then you get to the bigger stuff, because some people are like, well, it's just my personality to be anxious or to be fearful. Well, let's go back to Revelation chapter 20. Now, if you're saved and you experience fear and you deal with fear, no, you're not going to hell, because the blood covers that. But it's for those that just continually live in fear and fear everything else but God, that have never been saved. And fear is at the top of it, because you've got all those other things in your heart rather than the fear of the Lord. You're fearing everything else. But you start moving and progressing, you move into that perfectness of love that he's moving you into. to grow so that you can be the salt, so that you can be the light, so that you can lead others towards the cross. One thing that really, before I was saved, that turned me off to Christianity was the flaky Christian, the double-minded Christian, the one that was scared of their shadow when they walked out of the house. Now, after I was saved, yes, I was scared of my own shadow because I really didn't know. And that's the truth with everybody. You know, you're a babe in Christ.
Well, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. There is something to fear. There really someone to fear.
There is an aspect of fear that we do need to address, is the torment aspect of fear. It's a spirit of fear. God has not given us the spirit of fear.
I want to know what that word is.
Which one?
The spirit.
Pneuma.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You looked it up. It is, you sneaky dude.
It is not an impersonal force. It is an actual spirit.
Interesting.
And fear, the spirit of fear, brings torment. And it's very similar to the torment that we read of when you hold aught against a brother. So when you're operating in fear, not the fear of the Lord, not the reverence of the Lord, but being afraid and directing that fear towards all of these other things, you've opened yourself up to the tormentors, to the jailers, and they will torment you.
I've been there, done that.
Yeah.
Well, I had a point. I was thinking about this because I've been surrounded by women pretty much my whole life. I have a lot of sisters. I have daughters. I'm married. I have 7 wives. No, I'm just joking. I have one. She's more than enough. Anyhow, what I wanted to bring up is there is physiological fear in the sense of hormones. And I'm saying this from the perspective of being able to see that sometimes women especially can deal with major fight and flight, and it can overwhelm them to the point that they feel like they're going crazy or they're literally panicking even when they're not really choosing panic. And I don't want any of our listeners to get condemned, kind of feeling like, oh no, I got to work on my fear. When if you're going through premenopause or, you're doing something like that, you can feel weird and you can feel like you're in sin, like you're choosing. But if you look at the subject matter, you might be freaking out over nothing. And that's usually that physiological thing. There's something that if I took a syringe full of something and put it in your veins and you started feeling crazy and scared of stuff, that's not what we're talking about.
No.
And you have to learn how to deal with that because it can lead to that, and it can lead to that addiction, like we were talking about, that fear that you just, I need something, I need the drama, I need this, and you keep going. So I was just thinking about that, and just to be able to differentiate between the things in your flesh, a spirit, an outside demonic force drawing you into something, a mixture of all three, a demon trying to take advantage of the hormonal stuff, trying to take advantage of the airwaves and scare you to death with false propaganda or something that's going on, or even a real legitimate fear, whatever it is. But it's it's interesting. I think this is a timely program.
When you say that about, you've got the demonic dimension of it, manipulating the airwaves, manipulating your hormones, because there is the fight or flight, adrenaline and cortisol. I know a lot about cortisol after having the brain tumor removed. Yeah. My cortisol was up and down and left and right and all over the place. There was a time that I had not enough cortisol and it almost killed me. One of the things that does increase cortisol is licorice. I kid you not. So I was shoveling licorice in left and right to get my cortisol levels up. But you get very lethargic with no cortisol because your adrenaline is just shutting down. And a lot of times people that suffer from adrenal exhaustion, the cortisol, a lot of people that struggle with weight gain, it's because their cortisol levels are, I believe, too high. You can correct me, our listeners can correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but it affects everything. So when you get the demonic manipulating your hormones and the airwaves to manipulate your hormones, basically what it comes down to, they just want you sick and dead.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the fear of the coronavirus is going to have more of a mental health impact than the actual coronavirus.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
I really do. Not to say that this is not serious. This is a serious situation.
Yeah, it's unprecedented. It's a little bit weird.
Yeah. Isn't it weird, Dan, how, 19 years ago now, we started on radio.
2 weeks after 9/11.
We started the week of 9/11.
Yeah.
Several days after 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
We were supposed to start 2 weeks after 9/11, but our schedule got bumped up.
Yeah, he did. And put us right on the airwaves.
And we were dealing with people calling in, because that was a call-in show that we did, people calling in afraid of what was going on.
Well, you know what's interesting? You remember Bibles were just selling off the shelves and people were turning to the Lord. And even almost back then, it was like even celebrities, worldly celebrities, people were like singing Amazing Grace and at least looking God's direction, or at least going like, okay, well, everybody's looking that way. And you think it was a horrible event, probably a lot of political manipulation. I don't know what it was all about. There's a lot of things that are big question marks, but it's like, you look at what's going on right now, and we've been overdue for a pandemic, and hopefully it wasn't created in a laboratory. You know, we don't know that. We'll never know that, right? But it is real. The panic is real.
It's real.
And when you sit there and deal with it and have a calmness, and I've had to put down fear and turn to prayer for my older parents, and then friends, and I know people. I know of an individual right now, a family friend that came back from overseas, and pretty sure they have it. Yeah. And just you're like, oh. And you're concerned for his parents, and it's a lot of concern, a lot of things.
Something else that's good that does come out of this is it does cause us once again to consider our mortality, the fact that life on earth does not last forever, and causes you to think of the questions of, well, what does come after this life?
Yeah.
Because we get so wrapped up in the world around us, and we get into that mode of, well, this is all that's here. But then when you have something like this, people are afraid of the coronavirus because they're afraid of death.
Yeah.
And there is an answer. And that answer is through Christ. You can live through forever through Christ. As a matter of fact, I was having a discussion the other day, going back to the cataclysmic, epic explosions and everything like that. When we take a look at when Christ returns, there's this misconception that it is going to be the end of the world. It's not. It's going to be a change in the world. The world is not going to blow up. The earth, it is going to burn like an oven. We know that. There's going to be a lot of shaking to make things right that are painful. And yes, there are people that are going to die during that whole unfolding, the apocalypse. But the world is not going to blow up. It's going to change. It's going to be a change in, what would be the word to describe it, Dan? Change in epoch. Change is what it's going to be. It's not the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. Okay, it's not.
Take me back to college.
Yeah,
bro.
man. REM, man. When we were in college, if you listened to REM, you were cool. That was the cool. Them and Pearl Jam.
Yeah,
those
I
were the
remember
bands.
cleaning for inspections.
Yes,
The end of the world. As you know.
Yeah, it did feel like the end of the world.
Yeah, it did.
Doing that. But we get, again, it's not going to be this big explosion, the end of the world. Fear God. If you're not saved, man, if you're not saved and you've been kind of sitting on the fence, reach out to us. We'll talk to you more about that. God has to do that. You have to respond to it, but it's God that saves you. Glenn and Dan can't save you. You can't save yourself. Religion ain't going to save you.
And shall we take our
next call, please? He definitely wouldn't have saved you. But it's God. So that coffee I gave you is really good.
Thank you for calling Open Forum.
But reach out to us. Shoot us an email, lithoscry, LITHOSCRY @gmail.com. You can check out our website at lithoscry.com, LITHOSCRY.com. But I'd really encourage you, to share this edition with your friends. If you got friends that are scared, that are frightened about Corona, about what's going on in the world, share this edition with them. Not that Dan and I may offer any help to them whatsoever. We just hope that is how God uses us. I mean, we are two completely imperfect vessels. Our lives don't look anything like it looks like in the fishbowl. This vocal processor is awesome that we've got in here. But it's God. Most of the time before we come in here, I feel like a total dirt bag.
Yeah.
And can I even do this
that way?
Thank you.
You just smell that way.
I appreciate the brutal honesty.
Just being anywhere. Oh, y'all pray for me. No, Glenn's a good dude, man.
Thanks, Dan. Dan's a good dude, and we're going to go get some coffee filters so that in case we have to poop, we can take care of it. That's just being real, people. That's just being real.
That's too real.
Too real. Okay, I'll dial it back a little bit. But please reach out to us at lithoscry, LITHOSCRY @gmail.com. And while you're quarantined, peace out and rock on.
lithoscry.com